In the rolling hills of western Pennsylvania, where coal mines once carved deep scars into the earth, there exists a cemetery plot that has puzzled historians for over a century. 7 identical headstones stand in perfect formation, each bearing the surname Murphy, each marking the grave of a young man who died at exactly 21 years of age. Between 1847 and 1883, every male heir of the Murphy lineage met his end on his 21st birthday, under circumstances so varied yet eerily consistent that local authorities eventually stopped investigating. The Pennsylvania State Archives contain over 300 pages of testimonies, medical reports, and witness statements that were sealed by order of the state government in 1884. Only to be quietly transferred to a restricted vault in Harrisburg. What you're about to hear has never been told in its entirety, pieced together from recently discovered family letters, court records, and the personal diary of Dr. Ezra Caldwell, the physician who attended to 4 of these deaths and spent his final years obsessively documenting what he called the Murphy curse. Before we continue with the story of the Murphy family and their inexplicable tragedy that haunted an entire community for nearly 4 decades, I need you to do something for me. If you're fascinated by historical mysteries like this one, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into America's darkest secrets. And let me know in the comments below what state or city you're listening from. I love connecting with fellow mystery enthusiasts from all corners of our country. The truth about what happened to the Murphy sons is far more disturbing than any supernatural explanation could ever be. Rooted in the harsh realities of 19th century industrial America, family secrets that spanned generations, and a conspiracy of silence that protected the powerful while destroying the innocent. The year was 1846 when Seamus Murphy first arrived in Millfield, Pennsylvania, a burgeoning coal mining town nestled in the Appalachian foothills about 40 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. Like thousands of Irish immigrants fleeing the Great Famine, Seamus carried little more than calloused hands, an iron will, and dreams of prosperity in the New World. But unlike most refugees who arrived destitute and desperate, Seamus possessed something that would prove both a blessing and a curse. A letter of introduction from a mysterious benefactor in Ireland who had arranged his passage and promised him employment with the Keystone Coal and Iron Company. Millfield was a company town through and through, its dusty streets lined with identical wooden houses, painted a uniform gray, its economy entirely dependent on Keystone's massive operation that employed over 800 men in a network of mines that honeycombed the surrounding mountains. The company owned everything from the general store to the church pews, from the schoolhouse to the cemetery plots, creating a sealed world where every aspect of life was controlled by corporate decree. Even the town's name was a company invention. The original settlement had been called Greendale, but Keystone had rechristened it to reflect their vision of industrial efficiency over natural beauty. What made Millfield different from other company towns was the deliberate selection of its workforce. Rather than simply hiring whoever showed up looking for work, Keystone had developed a sophisticated recruitment system that targeted specific families from specific regions of Europe, particularly those fleeing political upheaval or economic disaster. These families arrived not as random immigrants, but as carefully chosen participants in what company documents euphemistically called the settlement program. A comprehensive system of housing, employment, and community development that promised security in exchange for long-term commitment. At 28, Seamus was older than most new arrivals, his weathered face bearing the marks of hardship that had driven him across the Atlantic. He possessed a sharp mind for numbers and an unusual ability to read and write in both English and Gaelic, skills that quickly caught the attention of Josiah Bentley, Keystone's operations manager. Bentley was a thin, calculating man in his 40s who had transformed Millfield from a struggling mining camp into one of the most profitable operations in Pennsylvania through what he called innovative labor management techniques. Within his first month, Seamus was promoted from the mines to the company's accounting office, a move that elevated him above most immigrants but also placed him in a position where he would witness the true scope of Keystone's control over its workers. The ledgers he maintained contained more than simple payroll records. They tracked every aspect of the employees' lives, from their debts at the company store to their attendance at the company-sponsored church services, from their children's performance in the company school to detailed notes about their political opinions and social associations. It was in this office, amid ledgers thick with coal dust and the weight of other people's secrets, that Seamus met Margaret O'Connell. She was the daughter of Dermot O'Connell, one of the first Irish families recruited for the settlement program, and she worked as a seamstress for the wives of company supervisors. Margaret possessed an education unusual for a woman of her background. She could read Latin as well as English, having been taught by nuns in Ireland before her family's emigration, and she had developed a sharp eye for the inconsistencies and mysteries that surrounded life in Millfield. Their courtship was brief but passionate, partly because genuine affection developed quickly between them, but also because both sensed that their individual survival in Millfield's complex social hierarchy would be enhanced by marriage. They wed in the fall of 1846 in the town's modest Catholic church, a ceremony attended by over 200 people, but officiated by Father McKenna, a priest whose sermons always seemed to emphasize the virtues of loyalty, obedience, and accepting one's appointed place in God's plan. Margaret was a beauty by any standard, with raven black hair and eyes the color of storm clouds. But more importantly to Seamus, she possessed a fierce intelligence and shared his growing unease about the true nature of their supposed good fortune. Their honeymoon cottage on Elm Street was one of the nicer houses available to Irish families, but it came with unspoken rules about when they could come and go, who they could entertain, and what topics were appropriate for discussion in a home that, they gradually realized, was never truly private. By spring of 1847, Margaret was pregnant with their first child, and Seamus had managed to save enough money to purchase a small plot of land on the outskirts of town, where he planned to build a proper house for his growing family. But when he approached the company's land office to complete the transaction, he discovered that his purchase was contingent on signing additional agreements that would bind his future children to the settlement program and guarantee their employment with Keystone when they came of age. The pregnancy was difficult. Margaret suffered from severe morning sickness that lasted well into her second trimester, but more troubling were the strange dreams that plagued her sleep. She reported visions of standing in a vast cemetery filled with identical headstones, each bearing the name of a young man she had never met but somehow recognized. Dr. Caldwell, the town's only physician and a man whose medical training had been supplemented by years of observing the peculiar patterns of illness and death in Millfield, prescribed bed rest and laudanum for her discomfort, but privately confided to his journal that he had seen similar symptoms in other pregnant women whose husbands held positions of responsibility within the company. The town itself was a powder keg of tensions that went far beyond the typical conflicts between different ethnic groups. The Irish Catholics, like the Murphys, faced discrimination from the Protestant German and English families who had arrived earlier. But all the workers lived under the constant threat of cave-ins, explosions, and the company's iron-fisted control over every aspect of their lives. Wages were paid in company scrip that could only be spent at company stores, keeping families perpetually in debt. But more insidious was the system of social advancement that rewarded cooperation and punished independence. Union organizers who tried to enter the town were met with violence, and more than one agitator had simply vanished into the surrounding forests, never to be seen again. But there were also stories, whispered in the Irish sections of town, about families who had tried to leave Millfield and found their departures blocked by mysterious legal complications or sudden financial emergencies that made it impossible for them to honor their debts to the company. It was against this backdrop of industrial exploitation and hidden coercion that the Murphy family would experience their first tragedy, one that would reveal the true cost of the prosperity that Keystone had promised its carefully selected workforce. The baby Margaret carried would be born healthy and strong, a son they would name Patrick after Seamus's father. But from the moment of his birth, Patrick Murphy was marked by a fate that had been determined long before his parents ever set foot in Pennsylvania. A destiny that would claim not only his life, but the lives of every male heir that would follow in the decades to come. Patrick Murphy's 21st birthday dawned cold and gray on March 15, 1868. Snow still clung to the mountains surrounding Millfield, and the morning air carried the acrid smell of coal smoke mixed with the metallic tang that always preceded a storm. Seamus had planned a small celebration at McBride's Tavern, one of the few establishments in town that welcomed Irish Catholics. But Patrick seemed unusually subdued as he dressed for work that morning. Margaret noticed her eldest son's pale complexion as he sat at their kitchen table, barely touching the hearty breakfast she had prepared. "You're looking peaked, my boy," she said, pressing her palm against his forehead. "Perhaps you should stay home today." But Patrick, who had inherited his father's stubborn streak along with his dark Irish features, insisted he felt fine. He had recently been promoted to shift supervisor in the mine's deepest tunnel, a position that came with both increased responsibility and scrutiny from the company bosses. Missing work on his birthday would raise questions he couldn't afford to answer. The morning shift began at 6 o'clock sharp, with the miners gathering in the lamp house to collect their safety equipment before descending into the earth. Patrick's crew consisted of 12 men, most of them Irish like himself, though a few German immigrants had been grudgingly accepted into their ranks. The tunnel they worked was known as Shaft 7, nearly 400 feet below ground, where the coal seam was particularly rich, but also notoriously unstable. At exactly 2:17 in the afternoon, according to the company's official incident report, a methane gas explosion tore through Shaft 7 with devastating force. The blast was heard throughout the town, rattling windows and sending women running into the streets, their faces white with terror. Mine explosions were common enough in those days, but this one was different, more precise, more contained than the random accidents that periodically claimed miners' lives. When the rescue crews finally reached the affected area 3 hours later, they found 11 men unconscious, but alive, their bodies thrown against the tunnel walls by the force of the explosion. Patrick Murphy was found at the exact center of the blast site, his body unmarked by fire or debris, lying peacefully as if he had simply laid down to rest. Dr. Caldwell, who was among the first to examine the scene, would later write in his private journal that Patrick appeared to have died not from the explosion itself, but from what he described as a cessation of vital functions occurring at the precise moment of the blast. The other miners, when they regained consciousness, all told the same strange story. They had been working normally when Patrick suddenly stopped mid-conversation, looked at his pocket watch and smiled. "Time's up," he had said, though none of them understood what he meant. Seconds later, the explosion had torn through their section of the mine. What made the incident even more peculiar was the discovery, 3 days later, of a letter in Patrick's coat pocket. Written in his own hand but dated 2 weeks earlier, it contained detailed instructions for his burial and a list of personal effects to be distributed among his siblings. At the bottom, in his characteristic careful script, were the words, "The first payment is made. The debt continues with my brothers." The company investigation concluded that Patrick had somehow triggered the explosion through negligence, though they could never explain how a single man could cause such devastation or why he alone had died while his colleagues survived. Keystone Coal and Iron paid a modest settlement to the Murphy family and ordered the incident report sealed, citing sensitivity to ongoing mining operations. But Dr. Caldwell kept his own records, and his growing suspicions about the true nature of Patrick's death would prove prophetic when exactly 5 years later, the second Murphy son would meet his own appointment with fate. The death of Patrick Murphy cast a long shadow over the family, but grief has a way of dulling even the sharpest edges of mystery, and life in Millfield continued with its familiar rhythms of work and survival. Seamus threw himself into his duties at the company office with renewed vigor, as if ledger books and inventory reports could shield him from the questions that haunted his nights. Margaret aged 10 years in the months following Patrick's funeral, her once luminous hair now streaked with premature grey. her storm-cloud eyes often distant and unfocused. But it was their second son, Thomas, who seemed most affected by his older brother's death. Where Patrick had been serious and responsible, Thomas possessed a reckless streak that worried his parents. He had inherited his mother's sharp intelligence but lacked Patrick's steady temperament, often finding himself in trouble with the company supervisors for questioning orders or defending fellow workers against unfair treatment. In the years following Patrick's death, Thomas began asking uncomfortable questions about the explosion in Shaft 7. He spent hours in the town's small library, poring over mining safety reports and newspaper accounts of similar incidents. He interviewed the surviving miners from his brother's crew, most of whom had since moved away from Millfield or found work in other trades, unwilling to return to the depths after what they had experienced. What Thomas discovered disturbed him deeply. Mining records showed that Shaft 7 had been deemed unsafe by previous inspections, with dangerous levels of methane gas detected in the weeks leading up to the explosion. More troubling was his discovery that Patrick had been asked to work a double shift on the day of his death, despite company policy prohibiting such overtime in hazardous areas. Most damning of all was a letter he found among his father's papers, written by Josiah Bentley himself, ordering Patrick to conduct a special inspection of the tunnel's gas pockets on his birthday. When Thomas confronted his father about the letter, Seamus's reaction was swift and violent. The quiet, bookish man who had spent years building a reputation for honesty and reliability suddenly became someone his son barely recognized, his face flushed with rage as he snatched the document from Thomas's hands and threw it into the fire. "Some secrets are better left buried, boy," Seamus said, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying a menace that made Thomas step back. "Your brother is dead, and no amount of digging will bring him back. Drop this foolishness before you join him." But Thomas, now approaching his own 20th birthday, refused to let the matter rest. He began meeting secretly with former Keystone employees who had left the company under suspicious circumstances, and what they told him painted a picture of corruption and conspiracy that reached far beyond a simple mining accident. There were stories of union organizers who had died in accidents after getting too close to exposing safety violations, of whistleblowers who had simply vanished into the Pennsylvania wilderness, and of a secret agreement between Keystone Coal and Iron and certain prominent families in the region that ensured profitable operations at any cost. Most disturbing of all were the tales of what the older miners called blood contracts, agreements made decades earlier that bound certain families to the company in ways that went far beyond simple employment. These contracts, according to the stories, required specific forms of payment that could only be satisfied through death, and the payments came due with clockwork precision, always on significant birthdays, always targeting the young men who might otherwise carry on their family names and challenge the established order. As Thomas's 21st birthday approached in the spring of 1873, he became increasingly paranoid and erratic. He began carrying a pistol and refused to work alone, insisting that someone was following him through the streets of Millfield. His mother found him one morning standing at his bedroom window, fully dressed despite the early hour, watching the sunrise with an expression of profound sadness. "They're coming for me, Ma," he said without turning around. "Just like they came for Patrick, but I'm not going to make it easy for them." Margaret Murphy tried to dismiss her son's fears as grief and imagination, but deep in her heart, she felt the cold touch of dread. The night before Thomas's birthday, she knelt before the small shrine she had built in her bedroom, surrounded by candles and rosary beads, and prayed with a desperation that bordered on madness. But some prayers, she would soon learn, are answered in ways that bring no comfort, only deeper mysteries and more profound grief. The dawn of Thomas Murphy's 21st birthday brought with it a fog so thick that the mountains surrounding Millfield completely disappeared, leaving the town feeling isolated and vulnerable, cut off from the outside world, like a ship adrift in an ocean of grey mist. Thomas Murphy had made careful preparations for his 21st birthday, but no amount of planning could have prepared him for the chain of events that would unfold on that fog-shrouded morning of March 22nd, 1873. Unlike his brother Patrick, who had met his fate in the familiar darkness of the mine shafts, Thomas's death would occur in broad daylight, witnessed by dozens of people, yet remain just as inexplicable and disturbing. He had taken the day off from his job at the company's timber mill, claiming illness, and instead positioned himself in the bell tower of St. Michael's Catholic Church, which offered a commanding view of all the approaches to Millfield. Armed with his father's old hunting rifle and a box of cartridges, Thomas had transformed the sacred space into a fortress, barricading the narrow stairway with heavy wooden benches. Father O'Malley, the elderly priest who had baptized all the Murphy children, discovered Thomas's presence during his morning prayers. The young man's appearance shocked the cleric. Hollow-eyed and gaunt, Thomas had obviously not slept in days, and his clothes hung loose on his frame as if he had stopped eating altogether. "Thomas, my son," the priest said gently, approaching with his hands visible and empty. "What troubles bring you to God's house with such weapons?" Thomas's response was rambling and desperate, a mixture of accusations and pleas that painted a picture of a conspiracy so vast and deeply rooted that Father O'Malley initially dismissed it as the ravings of a young man overwhelmed by grief. But as Thomas spoke, providing specific dates, names, and details that only someone with intimate knowledge could possess, the priest's skepticism began to give way to a growing horror. According to Thomas, his brother Patrick had not died in a random mining accident, but had been deliberately murdered as part of a grotesque ritual that bound the Murphy family to Keystone Coal and Iron through what he called a contract written in blood. The explosion in Shaft 7 had been carefully orchestrated, timed to occur at the exact moment of Patrick's 21st birthday, fulfilling an obligation that had been established decades earlier through circumstances that Thomas claimed to understand, but refused to fully explain. "They're coming for me today, Father," Thomas said, his voice breaking with emotion. "And when I'm gone, they'll come for Michael, and then for James and for little Brendan. Every son, every 21st birthday until the debt is paid in full or until there are no more Murphy men left to sacrifice." Father O'Malley tried to calm the young man, offering prayers and comfort, but Thomas was beyond consolation. He had spent months investigating his brother's death and claimed to have discovered documents that proved the existence of the blood contract, though he had hidden these papers in a location he would not reveal. His plan was simple. From his vantage point in the bell tower, he would identify whoever came to kill him and shoot them before they could complete their mission, breaking the cycle of death that had claimed Patrick and now threatened the entire family. At exactly noon, as the church bells began their daily toll, Thomas suddenly stiffened and pointed toward the main street of the town. "There," he whispered to Father O'Malley. "Do you see them? 3 men in dark coats walking this way. They're not from Millfield, I don't recognize any of them." The priest peered through the narrow window but saw only the normal midday bustle of townsfolk going about their business. The fog had lifted slightly, but visibility was still limited, and he could not make out the figures that had captured Thomas's attention. When he turned back to the young man, he found Thomas raising the rifle to his shoulder, his finger on the trigger, his face a mask of grim determination. What happened next would be debated by witnesses for years to come. At the exact moment that Thomas Murphy pulled the trigger, aiming at what he believed to be his approaching executioners, the rifle exploded in his hands with a force that should have been impossible. The weapon had been meticulously maintained and recently inspected, but it disintegrated as if it had been packed with far more gunpowder than any standard cartridge could contain. The explosion killed Thomas instantly, his body thrown against the stone wall of the bell tower with such violence that Father O'Malley, despite his decades of experience comforting the grieving and blessing the dead, fainted from the shock. When the priest regained consciousness 20 minutes later, he found Thomas's body in a position that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. The young man was kneeling, his hands clasped in prayer, his face peaceful and unmarked by the violence that had claimed his life. The investigation into Thomas Murphy's death was perfunctory at best. Company officials declared it a tragic accident caused by defective ammunition, and the rifle's manufacturer, a respected firm from Philadelphia, could offer no explanation for the weapon's catastrophic failure. The three mysterious strangers that Thomas had spotted were never identified, if indeed they had ever existed at all. But Father O'Malley kept his own counsel about what he had witnessed, writing detailed accounts in a private journal that would not be discovered until after his death 30 years later. And in that journal, he recorded one detail that the official investigation had overlooked. At the moment of Thomas's death, every clock in Millfield had stopped at precisely the same time, freezing the town in a moment of silence that lasted exactly 21 seconds before time resumed its normal flow. The death of Thomas Murphy sent shockwaves through the tight-knit Irish community of Millfield, but it was the reaction of Seamus Murphy that truly alarmed those who knew the family well. Rather than succumb to grief as he had after Patrick's death, Seamus became a man possessed by a fury that bordered on madness. He stormed into the offices of Keystone Coal and Iron the morning after his son's funeral, demanding to see Josiah Bentley and carrying with him a leather satchel that he clutched with white-knuckled intensity. What transpired during that meeting remains one of the central mysteries of the Murphy case, as both men took extraordinary measures to ensure their conversation remained private. But Clara Hoffman, Bentley's secretary, later told her sister that she heard raised voices through the heavy oak door of the manager's office, followed by what sounded like objects being thrown and furniture being overturned. When Seamus finally emerged 2 hours later, his face was deathly pale, and the leather satchel was no longer in his possession. Bentley, for his part, seemed equally shaken by whatever had occurred. Mrs. Hoffman reported that her employer cancelled all his appointments for the remainder of the week and spent long hours staring out his office window at the mountains that surrounded the town. On Friday evening, he summoned her to take dictation for what he described as a matter of urgent personal business. But when she arrived with her stenography equipment, she found him sitting motionless at his desk, apparently having changed his mind about whatever he had planned to reveal. The changes in Seamus Murphy were even more dramatic. The man who had once been known for his meticulous attention to detail and unwavering honesty began making errors in the company books, errors so obvious and frequent that even the most charitable observers questioned whether they were intentional. He started drinking heavily, arriving at work with whiskey on his breath and becoming increasingly belligerent toward his colleagues. Most disturbing of all, he began talking openly about what he called the price of prosperity and warning other immigrant families to be wary of opportunities that seemed too good to be true. Margaret Murphy watched her husband's descent into bitterness and alcohol with growing desperation, but her own behavior was becoming increasingly erratic as well. She had begun visiting the town's small cemetery every evening, not just to tend to the graves of her 2 dead sons, but to examine the headstones of other young men who had died under suspicious circumstances over the years. Her research revealed a pattern that chilled her to the bone. At least a dozen families in Millfield had lost male heirs at the age of 21, all in accidents that seemed random but shared certain disturbing similarities. There was Johann Steiner, a German immigrant's son who had fallen from a construction scaffold in 1859, despite being known as one of the most sure-footed workers in town. Pietro Rossini had died in 1864 when a supposedly stable minecart had crushed him against a tunnel wall, even though he had inspected the equipment himself just hours before. Most recently, in 1871, Edward Flanagan had drowned in the shallow creek that ran through the center of town, despite being an accomplished swimmer who had grown up playing in those same waters. Each death had been thoroughly investigated by the appropriate authorities and ruled accidental, but Margaret began to notice common threads that had been overlooked or deliberately ignored. In every case, the young man had been offered some form of advancement or special assignment by Keystone Coal and Iron in the weeks leading up to his death. Each family had received financial compensation that was unusually generous by the company's typically miserly standards. And in each case, the deceased had left behind written materials, letters, diary entries, or hastily scrawled notes that suggested knowledge of impending doom. But it was Margaret's third son, Michael, who provided the most disturbing piece of the puzzle. Now 19 years old and acutely aware of the fate that had befallen his older brothers, Michael had been conducting his own investigation into the family's troubles. What he discovered, hidden in a forgotten corner of the church's basement, was a collection of documents that cast the Murphy tragedies in an entirely new and terrifying light. The papers appeared to be contracts, written in a mixture of English and what looked like Latin legal terminology, dating back to the 1820s when Keystone Coal and Iron had first established operations in the region. The documents were signed by representatives of several prominent families, including what appeared to be Seamus Murphy's own father, who had apparently immigrated to Pennsylvania decades before his son's arrival and had made agreements that would bind his descendants for generations to come. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Millfield intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this tale of a family bound by blood to forces beyond their understanding. According to Michael's interpretation of the documents, the contracts established what could only be described as a feudal system, where immigrant families were provided with employment, housing, and financial support in exchange for commitments that extended far beyond normal labor agreements. The most chilling clause, repeated in every contract with minor variations, stipulated that each family must provide a tithe of blood to ensure the continued prosperity of the company and the community as a whole. The tithe was to be paid through the death of the eldest male heir of each generation upon reaching his 21st birthday, with the manner of death to be determined by circumstances that would appear accidental or natural to outside observers. In exchange for this ultimate sacrifice, the remaining family members would be guaranteed employment, protection, and financial security for as long as they remained in Millfield and honored the terms of their ancestors' agreements. Michael brought these documents to his parents on a cold December evening in 1873, spreading them across the kitchen table while the wind howled through the gaps in their cottage's wooden walls. Seamus's reaction was immediate and violent. He swept the papers to the floor and began tearing them to pieces, cursing in both English and Gaelic with a vehemence that shocked his wife and son. "Burn them!" he shouted, his face red with rage and terror. "Burn them all and never speak of this again. Do you want to join your brothers in the ground? Do you want to destroy what little protection we have left?" But Margaret had seen enough. As her husband destroyed the evidence that Michael had risked his life to obtain, she made a decision that would alter the course of events in ways none of them could have predicted. If the Murphy family was truly bound by a contract signed in blood, then perhaps the time had come to renegotiate the terms of their servitude, or die trying to break free from chains that had been forged long before any of them were born. The winter of 1873 was unusually harsh, with temperatures dropping far below normal and snow falling in quantities that the old-timers claimed they had never seen before. But the weather was nothing compared to the chill that had settled over the Murphy household, where three people who had once shared love and hope now lived in suspicious silence, each harboring secrets that could destroy them all. On the morning of February 14, 1874, exactly 2 months before Michael Murphy's 21st birthday, Margaret made a decision that would expose the truth behind decades of carefully orchestrated death and deception. She had spent sleepless nights formulating a plan that was as desperate as it was dangerous. But the alternative, watching another son die to satisfy an unholy agreement made by men she had never known, was unbearable. Rather than wait for the invisible forces that had claimed Patrick and Thomas to come for Michael, Margaret decided to take the fight directly to those responsible. She had carefully studied the patterns of the previous deaths and realized that each young man had died alone, isolated from potential witnesses or protectors at the crucial moment. This time would be different. Margaret began by confiding in Father O'Malley, sharing her suspicions about the contracts and begging him to provide sanctuary for Michael in the church when his birthday approached. The priest, still haunted by Thomas's death in the bell tower, initially resisted her pleas, but when Margaret showed him copies of some of the documents that Michael had found, copies she had made in secret before Seamus destroyed the originals, his attitude changed dramatically. Father O'Malley's own investigation into the church's historical records revealed disturbing connections between the Catholic parish and Keystone Coal and Iron that dated back to the company's founding. The church's construction had been funded entirely by Keystone, and several priests over the years had served not just as spiritual advisors, but as witnesses to contracts and agreements that blurred the line between religious blessing and legal obligation. Most damning was the discovery of a ledger hidden behind a false wall in the church's sacristy, containing detailed records of what were euphemistically called spiritual transactions. The ledger listed the names of families, the dates of their agreements, and the specific terms of their obligations, including the required offerings that each family was expected to make. The Murphy entry, written in Seamus's father's distinctive handwriting, made explicit reference to 7 sons as payment for passage and prosperity. With this evidence in hand, Margaret and Father O'Malley devised a strategy to expose the conspiracy and hopefully save not just Michael, but the other families who were still bound by similar agreements. They would need to convince the other victims' relatives to come forward, gather irrefutable proof of the systematic murders, and present their case to authorities outside of Millfield who were not under Keystone's influence. But their plans were complicated by Michael himself, who had inherited his family's stubborn streak, along with a reckless courage that sometimes bordered on stupidity. When he learned what his mother and the priest were plotting, he refused to hide in the church or flee the town as they suggested. Instead, he proposed a counterplan that was as audacious as it was risky. He would publicly confront Josiah Bentley and the other company officials, demanding that they explain the deaths of his brothers and formally release the Murphy family from whatever obligations bound them. The confrontation took place on a bitter cold morning in early March, just 2 weeks before Michael's birthday. Margaret had tried to dissuade her son from his course of action, but Michael was determined to force the truth into the open, regardless of the consequences. He arrived at the Keystone offices, carrying a copy of his grandfather's original contract and demanding an immediate meeting with Bentley and the company's board of directors. What followed was a scene that witnesses would describe as both terrifying and surreal. Bentley, faced with evidence he thought had been destroyed, underwent a complete transformation from his usual composed demeanor to something approaching panic. He began speaking rapidly in what sounded like a mixture of English and some other language that none of the observers could identify, his eyes darting constantly toward the windows as if expecting some external threat to materialize. The other company officials present seemed equally disturbed by Michael's revelations, but their reaction was more calculating than fearful. Led by Ezra Caldwell, not the doctor, but his cousin who served as Keystone's chief legal counsel, they huddled in whispered consultation before presenting Michael with what they described as a final settlement offer. The terms were simple and non-negotiable. In exchange for Michael's silence about the contracts and the circumstances surrounding his brother's deaths, the Murphy family would be released from all future obligations and provided with enough money to relocate anywhere in the country they chose. They would have 24 hours to consider the offer, after which it would be permanently withdrawn. Michael's response was immediate and unequivocal. He rejected the offer and promised to take his evidence to the Pennsylvania state authorities, the federal government, and the newspapers if necessary. As he turned to leave the office, Caldwell called after him with words that chilled everyone present. "Some debts cannot be forgiven, young Murphy. Some contracts cannot be broken. Your brothers learned that lesson, and so will you." That evening, as Michael walked home through the darkening streets of Millfield, he was followed by 3 men in dark coats. The same mysterious figures that Thomas had spotted from the church bell tower a year earlier. But this time, Michael was not alone. Margaret had arranged for several townspeople, including Father O'Malley and Doctor. Ezra Caldwell, the physician, not the lawyer, to maintain watch over her son, creating a network of protection that would make it impossible for the company's agents to strike without witnesses. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Josiah Bentley had been found dead in his office, apparently having suffered a massive heart attack during the night. His body was discovered slumped over his desk, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. His right hand clutching a half-written letter that began with the words, "The contracts must end," before trailing off into illegible scrawls. With Bentley's death, the carefully maintained conspiracy began to unravel with shocking speed. Other Keystone officials, fearing that they might be next, began confessing to their roles in what they described as a system of indentured servitude that had operated for decades with the tacit approval of local and state authorities. The contracts, they revealed, were not supernatural in origin, but were brutal examples of industrial exploitation that used superstition and fear to maintain control over immigrant families. The deaths of the young men, while technically murders, had been carried out through methods so subtle and sophisticated that they appeared to be accidents or natural causes. Patrick had been killed by a deliberately triggered gas explosion that was precisely timed and controlled. Thomas's rifle had been sabotaged with specially prepared ammunition that was designed to explode. The other young men had died through equally calculated methods that left no obvious evidence of foul play. But the most shocking revelation came from Dr. Caldwell's private records, which detailed his unwilling participation in the conspiracy. As the town's only physician, he had been forced to falsify death certificates and provide misleading testimony about the victims' deaths, all while secretly documenting the truth in his personal journals. His records revealed not just the methods used to murder the young men, but the names of the actual killers. A small group of professional assassins who traveled between company towns throughout Pennsylvania, carrying out similar accidents. Wherever immigrant families became troublesome or their sons reached the age where they might challenge the established order. Michael Murphy lived to see his 22nd birthday, becoming the first male heir in his family to break the cycle of death that had claimed his brothers and so many others before them. But survival came at a cost that would haunt the Murphy family for generations to come. The exposure of the conspiracy brought swift and brutal retaliation from forces that extended far beyond Keystone Coal and Iron. Within weeks of Bentley's death and the revelations that followed, the Murphy family began receiving death threats from unknown sources. Their cottage was vandalized repeatedly, Seamus was fired from his position with the company, and local merchants suddenly refused to sell them food or other necessities. More disturbing were the accidents that began plaguing other families who had come forward with their own stories of suspicious deaths and coercive contracts. Houses caught fire in the middle of the night, mine shafts collapsed unexpectedly, and several potential witnesses simply vanished without explanation. The message was clear. Speaking the truth about the industrial conspiracy was itself a death sentence. Father O'Malley's church was burned to the ground in April of 1874, with the priest barely escaping with his life. The official investigation blamed the fire on a faulty stove, but everyone in Millfield knew it was revenge for his role in exposing the contracts. The priest relocated to a parish in Philadelphia, taking with him copies of all the documents he had helped Margaret gather, but he would never again speak publicly about what he had witnessed in Millfield. Dr. Caldwell met a more dramatic end. Just days before he was scheduled to testify before a state commission investigating labor practices in Pennsylvania's mining towns, he was found dead in his office, apparently having taken his own life by ingesting a massive dose of laudanum. His suicide note claimed that he could no longer live with the guilt of his complicity in the murders, but those who knew him well doubted that he would have chosen such a cowardly exit from his troubles. The Murphy family themselves barely survived the wave of retribution that followed their defiance. In May of 1874, Seamus was found beaten unconscious on the road outside of town, his attackers unknown but their message clear. Margaret began suffering from mysterious illnesses that left her weak and often bedridden. symptoms that persisted despite treatment from doctors brought in from Pittsburgh. Even young Brendan, the youngest Murphy son who was still only 14, was targeted for harassment at school and on the streets, making it clear that the family's persecution would continue indefinitely if they remained in Millfield. Faced with the choice between continued resistance and survival, the Murphys made the painful decision to abandon everything they had built in Pennsylvania and start over somewhere far from the reach of Keystone Coal and Iron and its network of enforcers. In the summer of 1874, using money they had secretly saved over the years, plus a modest settlement negotiated through intermediaries, the Murphy family purchased train tickets to Oregon Territory, where Seamus had heard that Irish immigrants could find work in the lumber mills without the suffocating control of company towns. They left Millfield in the dead of night, carrying only what they could fit in 2 traveling bags, abandoning their cottage, their possessions, and the graves of Patrick and Thomas. The journey west was harrowing, not just because of the physical hardships of cross-country travel in 1874, but because of the constant fear that their enemies had followed them. At every stop, Seamus would scan the crowds for familiar faces or the telltale signs of professional killers, while Margaret clutched her remaining sons close and prayed that they had not simply delayed the inevitable. They settled in a small logging town called Cedar Falls, nestled in the Cascade Mountains about 60 miles east of Portland. The work was hard and dangerous, but it was honest labor without the web of contracts and obligations that had trapped them in Pennsylvania. For the first time in years, the Murphy family began to hope that they might have escaped their cursed fate. Michael married a local woman named Sarah Donnelly in 1876 and took work as a timber cruiser, evaluating forest stands for the sawmill companies. He lived quietly and carefully, never speaking about his past and always watching for signs that the darkness from Pennsylvania had followed him west. He and Sarah had 3 children together, 2 daughters and a son they named Patrick, in honor of Michael's deceased brother. Brendan, the youngest Murphy son, grew to manhood in Oregon and seemed to have completely escaped the shadow that had fallen over his family. He became a school teacher and later a school principal, respected in his community and apparently free from the curse that had claimed his older brothers. When he reached his 21st birthday in 1880, the family held its breath, but the day passed without incident, and they began to believe that the nightmare was truly over. But the Murphy family's relief was premature. In 1885, when Michael's son Patrick reached his 16th birthday, he began experiencing strange dreams and an overwhelming compulsion to research his family's history. Despite his father's desperate attempts to keep the past buried, young Patrick somehow learned about his grandfather's contracts and the deaths of his uncles, and he became obsessed with understanding the full truth about what had happened in Pennsylvania. The boy's obsession led him to seek out surviving records from the Keystone Coal and Iron conspiracy, and through a network of labor activists and journalists, he managed to piece together much of the story that his family had tried so hard to forget. What he discovered was that the Murphy family's ordeal had been part of a much larger system of industrial exploitation that had operated throughout the eastern United States for decades, using immigrant families as disposable resources in the pursuit of profit. More disturbing was his discovery that some of the families involved in similar contracts had never been able to escape their obligations, even after relocating to other parts of the country. The industrial interests that had created these systems of control had evolved and adapted, finding new ways to maintain their hold over the families they considered their property. Young Patrick's investigations brought unwanted attention to the Murphy family's new life in Oregon, and in the spring of 1887, just months before his 21st birthday, Michael began noticing the same warning signs that had preceded his brother's deaths. Strangers in town asking questions about the family, unexplained accidents involving people who had befriended them, and a general sense that they were being watched and evaluated by invisible observers. This time, however, the Murphy family was prepared. Using knowledge gained from their previous experiences and aided by allies they had cultivated in the labor movement, they developed a strategy to protect Patrick that went beyond simple hiding or flight. They would confront their pursuers directly, but with overwhelming force, and in circumstances that would make it impossible for the killers to operate with their usual secrecy. On March 15, 1888, exactly 20 years after Patrick Murphy Sr. had died in Shaft 7, his nephew and namesake celebrated his 21st birthday, surrounded by more than 50 armed supporters in the main square of Cedar Falls, Oregon. The event had been publicized throughout the region as a demonstration against industrial violence, and reporters from 3 different newspapers were present to document whatever might occur. The confrontation, when it came, was swift and decisive. 3 men in dark coats, the same type of professional killers who had stalked the Murphy family for years, approached the celebration with obvious intent to harm young Patrick. But they found themselves facing not a single vulnerable target, but a crowd of angry loggers, miners, and labor activists who had been waiting for exactly this moment. The would-be assassins were captured alive, and under interrogation, they revealed the names of their employers and the extent of the conspiracy that had operated in secret for decades. Their confessions led to arrests and investigations that exposed similar operations in 12 states, resulting in the prosecution of dozens of industrialists and the liberation of hundreds of families who had been trapped in systems of hereditary servitude. The final victory came in 1889, when the last of the original contracts was formally nullified by federal court order, and the Murphy family, along with all the other affected families, was officially declared free from any obligations to their former employers. The precedent set by their case helped establish new labor laws that made such exploitation illegal throughout the United States. Patrick Murphy Jr. lived to see his own children grow to adulthood without fear, and the Murphy name, which had once been synonymous with tragedy and mysterious death, became associated instead with courage and the fight against industrial oppression. The 7 graves in the Pennsylvania cemetery remain as monuments to the young men who died before their time, but they also serve as reminders that even the most entrenched systems of exploitation can be challenged and overcome by ordinary people who refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. Dr. Ezra Caldwell's journals, discovered after his death, were eventually published and became instrumental in exposing similar conspiracies throughout the industrial Northeast. His detailed documentation of the methods used to murder the young men led to reforms in mining safety, labor law, and the investigation of industrial accidents that saved countless lives in the decades that followed. The town of Millfield itself did not survive the scandal that emerged from the Murphy case. Keystone Coal and Iron declared bankruptcy in 1875, and without the company's presence, the community gradually dispersed as families sought opportunities elsewhere. Today, only the foundations of a few buildings mark the location where so much suffering occurred, and the cemetery where Patrick and Thomas Murphy are buried has become overgrown with weeds and forgotten by all but the most dedicated historians. But their story lives on as a testament to the power of ordinary people to resist extraordinary evil, and as a reminder that the price of freedom is often measured in blood, sacrifice, and the courage to speak truth to power, regardless of the consequences. The Murphy family's ordeal began with contracts signed in desperation by immigrants seeking a better life for their children, but it ended with the destruction of a system that had claimed hundreds of lives over the course of more than half a century. This mystery shows us that the most terrifying horrors are often not supernatural but profoundly human, born from greed, sustained by fear, and perpetuated by our willingness to look the other way when convenient. The Murphy sons died not because of a curse or other worldly forces, but because powerful men decided that their lives were acceptable sacrifices for economic prosperity. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Or do you think there are still secrets buried in the ruins of places like Millfield? Leave your comment below and let me know if you think such conspiracies could exist in today's world. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories about hidden American history, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The truth is often stranger and more frightening than any fiction, and there are still stories waiting to be told about the dark corners of our nation's past. See you in the next video.